In 1066, a forgotten battle shattered Viking power forever. Before Hastings, before Norman rule, an exhausted English army collided with the last great Norse invasion and ended 3 centuries of fear in a single brutal day. England had been bleeding for nearly 300 years by the time the Vikings returned for the last time. The raids had begun as whispers on the coast, small ships, quick fires, vanished enemies, but over generations those whispers became kingdoms. The Norse did not just attack England, they carved themselves into it. They ruled its cities, named its towns, married into its bloodlines, and bent its politics around their axes. By the middle of the 11th century, England was not a victim of Viking terror anymore. It was a land shaped by it. And yet in the autumn of 1066, that long, violent relationship was about to end, not with a slow decline, not with treaties or fading traditions, but with sudden, overwhelming force. The man who came to reclaim England for the Vikings was not a raider. He was not a wanderer or a pirate king chasing silver. His name was Harold Sigurdsson, remembered by history as Harald Hardrada, and he was the most dangerous Viking ever to live. Hardrada was not a relic of the old age. He was its final evolution. Born in Norway, hardened in exile, forged in the wars of Eastern Europe and the Byzantine Empire, he was something England had never faced before, a Viking who had learned how empires fought. By the time he turned his gaze west, Harald Hardrada had already lived several lifetimes. As a young man, he had fought and lost at the Battle of Stiklestad, watching his half-brother, King Olaf Haraldsson, die and become a saint. He fled east and spent years as a mercenary commander in the service of the Byzantine emperors, leading elite troops, crushing rebellions, and accumulating wealth beyond imagining. He learned discipline, siege warfare, logistics, and command on a scale no Scandinavian king before him had ever experienced. When he finally returned to Norway, he took the throne not as a hopeful claimant, but as a conqueror who knew exactly what power looked like. By 1066, Harald Hardrada was in his 50s, tall, immense, broad-shouldered, his presence alone enough to dominate a hall. The sagas describe him as relentless, brilliant, and utterly without mercy. He believed with absolute certainty that England was his by right. This was not a fantasy. Decades earlier, a tangled web of treaties and broken promises between Scandinavian and English kings had left claims unresolved. To Harold, those claims were not dead words, they were unfinished business. England, meanwhile, was ruled by King Harold Godwinson, a man no less formidable, but cut from a different cloth. Harold Godwinson was not born a king. He had risen through loyalty, military skill, and political instinct, becoming the most powerful noble in England long before he wore the crown. He knew England's terrain, its people, and its fragile balance of power better than anyone alive. When King Edward the Confessor died childless in January 1066, Harold Godwinson took the throne knowing full well that others would contest it. The question was not if invasion would come, but from where. The English king expected danger from the south. Across the Channel, William of Normandy was already preparing his own claim, building ships and gathering knights. Harold Godwinson stationed his army along the southern coast for months, watching the sea, waiting for sails that did not come. What he did not expect was that the true blow would fall from the north, and that it would come faster, harder, and with more violence than anyone imagined. Harold Hardrada did not come alone. At his side was Tostig Godwinson, Harold's own brother. Tostig had once been Earl of Northumbria, ruling the north of England in the king's name, but he had ruled harshly, alienating nobles and peasants alike, until rebellion forced him into exile. Harold Godwinson, choosing stability over blood, had refused to restore him. To Tostig, this was not politics, it was betrayal. He had spent years wandering Europe, nursing his hatred, searching for a patron powerful enough to destroy his brother and reclaim what he believed was stolen from him. In Harold Hardrada, he found exactly that. Together they assembled one of the largest Viking fleets ever launched against England. Contemporary sources estimate 300 longships carrying perhaps 9,000 to 10,000 warriors, Norwegians, Danes, hardened veterans who believed they were marching into a divided, weakened land that would fall as it always had. They did not come to raid, they came to conquer, install Harold as king, and end the English line forever. In early September 1066, the fleet entered the Humber River and sailed deep into English territory, moving with terrifying confidence. Villages fell without resistance. The north, long accustomed to Viking presence, was slow to mobilize. The first real confrontation came near Fulford, just south of York, where English forces led by Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria attempted to block the advance. The Battle of Fulford was short, brutal, and decisive. Harold Hardrada smashed the English army, exploiting the terrain with practiced precision, crushing resistance and scattering survivors. York, the ancient heart of Viking power in England, opened its gates days later. For Harold, It must have felt like destiny fulfilling itself. The old Danelaw was welcoming its king home. But this victory carried a dangerous illusion. Fulford convinced the Norwegians that the campaign would be easy. The English north was broken. The king was far away in the south. There was time to breathe, to negotiate, to enjoy the fruits of success. Harold Hardrada did not know that Harold Godwinson had already begun one of the most extraordinary forced marches in military history. When news reached the English king that the north had fallen, he did not hesitate, he did not argue, he did not delay. Leaving the southern coast exposed to Norman invasion, Harold Godwinson gathered his household troops and the remnants of the feared and marched north at a speed that stunned even his own commanders. Day after day, his army pushed forward, exhausted, blistered, hungry, covering distances that should have taken weeks in a matter of days. The men marched, knowing that if they failed, England would die twice in 1 year. Harold Hardrada, encamped near York, had no idea what was coming. On September 25, 1066, he left a large portion of his army and their armor at their ships, near a narrow crossing called Stamford Bridge. The day was warm, the sky was clear. This was supposed to be a formality. Hostages from York were expected. Negotiations were planned. Harold wore light armor, if any at all. His men relaxed, confident that no English force could possibly reach them in time. They were wrong. By midday, dust rose on the horizon. English banners appeared where none should have been. Harold Godwinson's army had arrived, silent, compact, lethal. Surprise was total. The Norwegians scrambled, shocked into motion, racing to form lines while messengers ran desperately back toward the ships to retrieve armor and reinforcements. What should have been a peaceful exchange turned into a fight for survival in a matter of minutes. The bridge itself became the first killing ground. A single Norse warrior, his name lost to history, held the narrow span against the advancing English, buying precious time for his comrades. He fought alone, cutting down anyone who tried to cross, turning the bridge into a choke point of blood and bodies. Arrows failed, spears failed. Only when an English soldier floated beneath the bridge and thrust upward with a spear did the defender finally fall. By then, the delay had already shaped the battle. Harold Hardrada formed his army beyond the bridge, rallying men as they arrived, shouting orders, towering above them like something out of legend. He was hit early by an arrow that tore through his throat. The last great Viking king fell without armor, without ceremony, collapsing into the grass as the battle roared around him. His death did not end the fight, but it sealed its fate. What followed was not just a battle, it was the extinction of an age, and England was about to pay for it in blood. The death of Harold Hardrada should have ended the battle quickly. In most armies of the age, the fall of the king meant collapse, panic, flight. But the men who stood on the fields near Stamford Bridge were not peasants dragged into war. They were veterans of a lifetime of violence, men who had crossed seas and kingdoms behind one banner, men who believed they were standing at the center of fate itself. When Harold fell, the army did not break, it convulsed. Command passed to Eystein Orr, one of Harold's most trusted lieutenants, a warrior known for ferocity even among Norsemen. But Eystein was not on the field when the battle began. He was miles away, guarding the ships with the heaviest armor, the mailed coats and helmets left behind in the confidence of victory. When messengers reached him, screaming that the king was dead and the English were upon them, he did not hesitate. He ordered an immediate forced march back towards Stamford Bridge, driving his men forward at a punishing pace, armor biting into flesh, breath tearing through lungs. What followed would later be remembered as Orr's Storm. While Eystein's men ran themselves toward exhaustion, the battle at the bridge reached its most savage phase. Harold Godwinson had achieved surprise, but surprise alone does not win a battle against thousands of determined warriors. The Norse formed a shield wall on the open ground beyond the river, locking shields edge to edge, bracing spears, creating a living barricade of wood and iron. The English advanced into it again and again, hacking, pushing, dying. The noise was overwhelming. Steel on steel, splintering shields, screams of pain and rage, the low thunder of feet churning earth into mud. Harold Godwinson rode along his lines, visible, deliberate, refusing to withdraw from the front. He understood what this moment meant. This was not just another battle. This was the reckoning England had avoided for generations. If the Norse won here, there would be no recovery, no regrouping, no second chance. The North would fall permanently, and the South would soon follow. Harold pressed the attack with relentless pressure, knowing his men were exhausted, knowing they had marched themselves half to death just to be here. Victory demanded everything. The Norse fought like men who believed the world was ending. Without Harold, there was no future to retreat toward, no kingdom waiting across the sea. This was glory or extinction, and they chose extinction on their feet. Axes rose and fell until arms failed, spears shattered, shields became useless splinters. Men fought hand to hand, grappling, biting, stabbing with broken blades, slipping on blood-soaked grass beneath a sun that did not care. Then Eystein Ore arrived. His charge should have saved the Norse army. Fresh men, fully armored, roaring into the flank of a tired English force. It was the kind of reinforcement that could reverse the tide of a battle. For a brief moment it almost did. Eystein's warriors slammed into the English lines with terrifying force, cutting down men who had already fought for hours, driving the English backward, reopening the wound that had nearly closed. But the cost of the march had already been paid. Ore's storm had broken the bodies of the men who ran it. By the time they reached the field, many were already collapsing from heat, exhaustion, and dehydration. Their armor became a prison, their strength burned out in minutes instead of hours. Eystein himself fought like a man possessed, carving a path through English ranks, but even his fury could not defy biology. He fell where he stood, surrounded by bodies, his charge spent. With Ore dead and Harold gone, the Norse resistance began to fracture. Not rout, not panic, but something colder and more final. Groups fought independently, islands of defiance surrounded by enemies. The English pressed in from all sides, compressing the battlefield, denying space, denying breath. The river behind the Norse turned from an escape route into a grave. Men tried to swim and drowned under the weight of mail. Others were cut down on the banks, dragged into the water by the momentum of retreating bodies. What makes Stamford Bridge so devastating is not just who died, but how completely the Norse power was annihilated. This was not a defeat that left room for recovery. This was not a loss that could be explained away as bad luck or poor timing. This was the destruction of leadership, manpower, momentum, and myth in a single afternoon. Of the hundreds of ships that had brought the great army to England, only a fraction were needed to carry the survivors home. Later chroniclers claimed that 24 ships were enough to take them back across the North Sea. Whether the number is exact or not, the truth behind it is unmistakable. An invasion force had been reduced to a remnant. Among the survivors was Olaf Haraldsson, Harold Hardrada's son. He did not flee in chaos, he negotiated. Harold Godwinson allowed the Norse survivors to leave England in peace, extracting oaths that they would never return in force. It was a calculated mercy. Harold was not trying to be generous, he was trying to survive what came next. He knew another army was waiting across the channel, watching, preparing. Every man spared here was a man not lost to the next fight. The field at Stamford Bridge fell silent by evening. The silence after a battle like this is not peace. It is exhaustion so deep it feels like emptiness. Bodies lay scattered across the grass, Norse and English indistinguishable in death. Broken shields floated in the river. Weapons lay where hands had failed to lift them again. The last great Viking king was dead. His dream extinguished not by trickery or treachery, but by an English army that refused to break. And yet, for all its significance, Stamford Bridge would be almost immediately overshadowed. Because even as Harold Godwinson stood victorious in the north, even as the Viking Age collapsed behind him, the future was already burning its way ashore in the south. William of Normandy had landed in England just days after Stamford Bridge. Fresh troops, rested horses, heavy cavalry, an army untouched by forced marches or attritional slaughter. Harold Godwinson did not have time to celebrate. He did not have time to mourn his dead or honor his victory. Within days, he turned his army around and marched south again, demanding from his exhausted men one last miracle. Stamford Bridge had ended Viking power forever, but it had also broken the English army that achieved it. That is the cruel irony of 1066. The battle that saved England from the Vikings also left it vulnerable to conquest. Stamford Bridge was the last time a Scandinavian king would invade England with the intent to rule it. The age of longship empires died there, on a quiet river crossing in Yorkshire, under a sun that watched an old world bleed out. From that day forward, Vikings would trade, settle, and serve as mercenaries, but they would never again dominate England through raw force of arms. The Norse gods lost their final wager that afternoon, but England would not be allowed to rest in its victory. Not yet. Stamford Bridge did not feel like the end of an era to the men who survived it. Ends are rarely announced when they happen. They are quiet, confusing, and usually mistaken for something temporary. To the Norwegians who limped back to their ships, dragging wounded kingsmen and bloodied banners, this was a disaster. But disasters could be recovered from. Vikings had lost battles before. Kings had died before. What made Stamford Bridge different was not immediately visible on the battlefield. The true destruction lay in what could no longer be rebuilt. Harold Hardrada had been more than a king. He was the final unifying force of the Viking world. His life bridged generations. He had fought alongside men who remembered the early raids and commanded soldiers who had never known a world without Viking dominance. His authority, wealth, and reputation pulled warriors from across Scandinavia into a single coherent force. When he died, there was no one left who could do that again. Norway fractured almost immediately. Harold's son, Olaf Haraldsson, returned home with survivors, but not with conquest, not with glory, and not with the aura of inevitability his father had carried. The great invasion that was supposed to restore Scandinavian dominance in England had ended in annihilation. The cost in manpower was catastrophic. Thousands of seasoned warriors, men who could not be replaced quickly if ever, were gone. Entire ship crews vanished. Entire noble lineages ended in the mud along the River Derwent. In the Viking world, reputation was power. Stamford Bridge shattered the illusion that Norse armies were unstoppable. For centuries, England had been a proving ground, a land that bent eventually, even after resistance. This time, England had not bent. It had struck back, hard and decisively, killing the greatest Viking king who ever lived. That knowledge spread quickly along the trade routes and sea lanes of the north. Denmark watched and learned. The Danish kings, already shifting away from endless warfare and toward consolidation and Christian kingship, saw Stamford Bridge as confirmation that the age of expansion was over. Raiding no longer brought easy rewards. England was defended, organized, and brutal when pushed to the edge. The cost-benefit equation that had fueled Viking aggression for generations no longer worked. There was more to gain in ruling at home than dying abroad. Sweden turned inward. The eastern routes, once arteries of Viking wealth flowing through rivers to Byzantium and the Islamic world, were drying up. Political changes, fortified trade cities, and stronger regional powers made long-distance raiding less profitable and more dangerous. The warrior aristocracy that had once defined Viking society began transforming into landed elites, more interested in inheritance than heroics. Even the myths began to shift. For centuries, Viking culture had been sustained by the promise of glory through violence, Valhalla, eternal feasting, honor through death. But Stamford Bridge offered no heroic ending. Harald Hardrada did not die in a climactic duel with a rival king. He died suddenly, struck down at a moment of overconfidence, wearing little armor, far from home. His army did not ascend to legend. It was butchered in retreat, drowned in rivers, hunted across open ground. This was not a saga ending. It was a warning. Christianity accelerated what the battlefield had begun. By 1066, Scandinavia was already Christian in name, but still deeply divided in practice. The old gods lingered in custom and belief, especially among warriors. Stamford Bridge weakened the last cultural stronghold of pagan identity, the warrior elite. As the old fighters died without replacement, their values died with them. Kings increasingly framed power not in terms of Odin's favor, but divine right under Christ. The Viking Age was not defeated by faith alone, but faith filled the vacuum left behind by military collapse. England felt this change almost immediately. After Stamford Bridge, there would be no more great Viking invasions, no fleets of hundreds of ships, no foreign kings landing to claim the throne by axe and fire. The threat that had defined English politics for centuries evaporated in a single season. The Danelaw remained culturally distinct, but it was no longer a launching point for conquest. It was absorbed, slowly and permanently, into a broader English identity. And yet Stamford Bridge is remembered poorly. It does not sit comfortably in the popular imagination. It lacks the clean symbolism of Hastings. There are no famous tapestries, no iconic cavalry charges, no clear narrative of conquest replacing one ruler with another. Stamford Bridge is inconvenient. It reminds us that history is not a straight line, that endings can come just before new catastrophes begin. Because even as Viking power collapsed in the north, England was walking into its own transformation in the south. Harold Godwinson's victory came at a terrible price. His army, already strained by months of coastal defense, had marched north at impossible speed and fought a brutal battle, and then turned around almost immediately. Wounds were barely bandaged, armor was dented and split, horses were lame or dead. Men who should have been resting were forced back onto the road south toward another enemy who had been waiting patiently. William of Normandy was not a Viking. He did not rely on shock and terror alone. He brought cavalry, disciplined infantry, and a logistical apparatus refined through years of continental warfare. His men were fresh. His commanders were rested. His army was unified by clear hierarchy and purpose. When Harold Godwinson marched south to meet him, the English king was no longer fighting from strength. He was fighting from obligation. The destruction of Viking power at Stamford Bridge indirectly enabled Norman conquest. Had Harold Hardrada won, England would have fallen to a Scandinavian empire. Had Harold Godwinson waited, consolidated, and chosen his battles, William might have been repelled. Instead, history demanded too much of one man in too short a time. Stamford Bridge saved England from one world, but left it exposed to another. This is why Stamford Bridge matters, not because it was the bloodiest battle of 1066 or the most famous or the most visually dramatic. It matters because it was the moment when the old rules stopped working. The Viking model, raid, intimidate, dominate, failed permanently. The Norse world did not realize it immediately, but it would never again produce an army capable of reshaping Europe through violence alone. The age of long ships ruling coastlines was over. The age of centralized kingdoms, bureaucratic power, and feudal obligation was beginning. And standing between those two worlds was one exhausted English king, walking south through a land that no longer resembled the one he had defended his entire life. Stamford Bridge did not just kill Harold Hardrada, it killed the future the Vikings believed was still theirs. History often chooses its symbols poorly. When people speak of 1066, they speak of Hastings. They speak of Norman knights, of arrows in the sky, of a king falling beneath a banner on a southern hill. But Hastings did not end an age. It replaced a ruler. Stamford Bridge did something far rarer. It closed a door that had been open for 3 centuries and sealed it forever. By the time Harold Godwinson turned his army south, the Viking world was already dead. It just didn't know it yet. The men who marched with him after Stamford Bridge were not the same men who had rushed north weeks earlier. They were hollowed out. The forced marches had stripped muscle from bone. The fighting had burned away any illusion of invincibility. Stamford Bridge had been won through endurance, not dominance, and endurance always exacts its price later. Harold's army carried victory like a wound that would not close. But Harold had no choice. England did not allow pauses. Power invited challenges, and William of Normandy had crossed the Channel the moment the English king turned north. Timing, not destiny, ruled 1066. Harold had defeated the greatest Viking king in history, and in doing so, had exhausted the only army that could have stopped the Normans cleanly. That irony defines Stamford Bridge. The battle did not just end Viking power. It ended the last moment when England could have chosen its own future without foreign conquest. Had Harold Hardrada won, England would have become Scandinavian. Had Harold Godwinson waited, England might have resisted Normandy. Instead, England stood between two worlds and survived only long enough to watch one die before being reshaped by the other. But the Viking Age did not fade quietly elsewhere either. Across Scandinavia, Stamford Bridge became a story told with discomfort. It did not inspire new expeditions. It discouraged them. Young men still dreamed of adventure, but kings began talking about borders, inheritance, churches, and laws. The idea of conquering England by force became unthinkable, not because it was impossible in theory, but because it had proven catastrophic in reality. The cost had finally exceeded the myth. The longship, once the ultimate weapon of terror, became a tool of trade and transport. Raids shrank in scale, violence localized, power consolidated inward. The world was changing, and Stamford Bridge was the moment the Vikings collided with that change head-on and lost. Even memory itself turned against them. The sagas tried to preserve glory, but they struggled with this ending. Harold Hardrada was given heroic traits, legendary stature, poetic death. But the facts refused to cooperate. He died early in the battle. He wore little armor. He was caught off guard. His army was annihilated in retreat. There was no ambiguity, no what if, no lingering threat. Stamford Bridge left no room for resurrection. This is why it is overlooked. Hastings offers a cleaner story: conqueror versus king, victory reshaping a nation. Stamford Bridge offers something more unsettling, a civilization reaching its limit and collapsing in real time. No single battle before or after did more to permanently alter the balance of northern Europe. The Vikings did not lose power gradually. They lost it in an afternoon, and yet the world they built did not vanish. The irony of Viking defeat is that their cultural victory endured. The English language absorbed Norse words. English law carried Scandinavian influence. Place names, customs, and trade routes remained Viking long after Viking armies did not. The Norse lost political dominance, but they won permanence. They became part of the fabric of the lands they once terrorized. Stamford Bridge ensured that this inheritance would be quiet, not violent. The sons of raiders became farmers, merchants, nobles, and Christians. The old gods receded into story. Odin became literature. Thor became metaphor. The age of heroic violence gave way to administration, borders, and written law. The world became less dramatic, but more stable. And standing at the hinge of that transformation was one exhausted English king. Harold Godwinson would die weeks later at Hastings, his victory at Stamford Bridge already eclipsed by defeat. History remembers him as the king who lost England, not the king who saved it from the Vikings forever. That is another injustice of memory. Harold achieved what no ruler before him had managed. He broke the cycle of Scandinavian domination. He paid for it with his crown, his life, and his legacy. But the Vikings never came back. Not like that. Not with kings and claims and armies meant to rule. The age of fear ended at Stamford Bridge, even if no one stopped to notice. That is why this battle matters. It was not loud in memory, but it was final in consequence. It marked the moment when the Viking world, once the terror of Europe, became a chapter instead of a threat. The longship sailed home, lighter than they arrived, carrying survivors who would tell stories not of conquest but of annihilation. The North remembered. The South moved on. When the dust of 1066 settled, England was no longer facing outward toward Viking horizons. It was turning inward, toward monarchy, feudalism, and centralized power. The old world had died, not with ceremony but with exhaustion, blood and silence beside a narrow bridge. Stamford Bridge was not just a battle, it was the end of the Viking Age, and endings like that are rarely remembered because they do not announce themselves. They simply happen, and the world that comes after pretends the one before it was always destined to disappear, but it wasn't. It had to be killed, and in 1066, at Stamford Bridge, it was.